Okay, and you're live.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Gulf Specimen Marine Lab and Aquarium's Friday live feed. We are so happy to have you here. I just want to apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we've had in the past, but to let you know, those have been edited and they've been put on our YouTube channel in case you missed one of the live feeds and you'd like to catch up. Today's topic is about Port St. Joe, a feature west of Panacea where we collect for the aquarium area. And I have a little map here to show you. This is a really large bay on the coast of Florida. And last Tuesday, I took our high school interns out to Cape San Blas to T.H. Stone Memorial State Park, which is out here on the very end of the peninsula. But Port St. Joe Bay has a large number of seagrass beds and intermixed with sand flats. Here, my graphics are sticking together because of the water, but had you been with us on that trip, or had you been coming on a collection trip with us, this is the kind of seagrass meadow that you might see. And I want to talk about those seagrasses a minute, and we're going to move over here. Okay, Port St. Joe Bay has a large amount of turtle grass. This is turtle grass. These are actual flowering plants. These are not algae. So these actually have roots, stems, and leaves, just like all the true plants. And you can see that they're rooted, and just like the grass in your yard, they usually propagate with they have an underground stem called the stolon that grows through the sand and puts up shoots periodically of this wide blade grass. This is the turtle grass, anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch across. And this is the primary producer in St. Joe Bay. It's producing the majority of the food that is supporting the food chain there. Now, many of the seagrass beds are mixed with this other seagrass. This is called Manatee Grass, and it has a real round blade, but just like the turtle grass, it has an underground stem. You can see here. And this was covered in the sand up to about here. Okay, and then the manatee grass has a real round leaf, unlike most of the seagrasses, which have a flat leaf of some sort. But we actually have about 6 different seagrasses that are found in the state of Florida. But the dominant one is turtle grass, manatee grass, and one that you may even find right at the seashore called shoal grass, which has a narrow blade. But these are very important as far as fixing carbon and turning that carbon into food. You know, that's a big issue anymore in environmental circles, because one of the things that is driving global warming is an abundance of carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet gets, because it acts more like a greenhouse. But if you can fix that carbon that's in the carbon dioxide, then it takes it out of the system and reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the air. I read today that coastal seagrass beds, salt marshes, and mangrove swamps actually fix 5 times more carbon than tropical rainforests. So even though it's important to protect those tropical rainforests, it's also equally important to protect our seagrass beds and marshes, quit covering them up for housing developments, quit allowing pollution and sediments to come into those areas, which kills the seagrasses. So it's really, really very important. Now, just to kind of talk about that food chain a little bit, there are several things that feed directly on the grasses. Among those things are sea urchins. And this is the most common sea urchin in Port St. Joe Bay, and there are just thousands of these. And I'm going to turn this one over because I want you to see the teeth. Okay, this is his mouth down here, and these 5 little white points are the teeth. Okay, and so these are grazing directly on the seagrass. Okay, another organism that grazes directly on the seagrass are fighting conchs. And I think I had a fighting conch somewhere. Let me look. I don't see it right now, but maybe we can bring it out a little bit later. But it's a snail, and it's an herbivorous snail, and it feeds on seagrass. Now, other seagrass predators are bigger. Okay, for instance, manatees feed on seagrass. Sea turtles, green sea turtles feed on seagrass. We're doing the slide, you know, outside in the wind. Okay? I don't have a picture of a sea turtle, unfortunately, but we've done a whole program on sea turtles, and green sea turtles actually munch down seagrass. Now, when we went on our field trip to Port St. Joe last Saturday, we saw a lot of stuff that looks like this, where you have seagrass and sandy bottom kind of intermixed. You'd have a little bit of seagrass, you'd have a little bit of sandy bottom. And this is very, very typical of what you find in Port St. Joe Bay. And it's one of the reasons it's one of our most diverse areas to collect. Besides those little sea urchins, we find, particularly in these sandy bottoms, a lot of clams. Clams are bivalves that bury into the substrate. This is the southern quahog. Those of you who are used to ordering clams in restaurants, this is oftentimes the organism that you are served. And our southern quahog will get quite large. The shell will extend all the way out to here. So they can be very, very large. And this is called the prickly cockle. And you know that old nursery rhyme about cockles and mussels? Both of those are found in abundance in Port St. Joe Bay. Both this little prickly cockle, sometimes called the China cockle, and also the giant Atlantic cockle are found in those areas. Another organism, another bivalve that's very common in Port St. Joe Bay are these pin shells. Now this is just the shell, the live animal is gone, but these anchor this way down in the seagrass bed. So the seagrass is going to be coming up all the way around it. It's going to open up the very top part of the shell, pull water in over its gills, and sort out any organic material that might be there. And there's a lot of that there, because as the seagrass begins to break down, it forms these tiny, tiny little particles of organic substrate that get bacterial mats that grow on the top of them. Algae grow on to break down. There's more and more surface area for those other things to grow. So it becomes a very, very rich, nutritious food source for a lot of the things that are living, particularly in the sand, like the clams and the cockles, like this little sand dollar, like these sea stars. We actually found a couple of this particular sea star while we were in Port St. Joe Bay, and we found several sand dollars. This is another of the burrowing sea stars, meaning that they live actually down in the sand. I couldn't show you them in their natural habitat because you just wouldn't see them. Same thing with the sand dollar. They're going to be covered over with the substrate, this sandy substrate that's in between these little beds of grass. Okay, Now, eating up all of these little clams and the pin shells and other bivalves. There's like a lot of, this is a shell of a little bivalve that's very, very common there called the crossbarred Venus. And these are just thick in some parts of Port St. Joe. And feeding on those are a lot of predatory snails, like this beautiful tulip snail. I'm going to try and get him loose from here. He's got a beautiful, like, purple body, and this little trap door, this operculum, is going to hold him back in while I'm holding him out of the water so that he doesn't lose the water that's over his gills. That's really important to his survival. He might get caught out on a low tide somewhere, and he'd want to pull all of that muscly tissue back in and protect himself using this operculum or trap door. Okay, now he would prey on any of these clams. This is another snail that would prey on the clams. This one's called a lightning whelk, and this one kind of sneaks up on them and waits for them to open up their shell a little bit, and then it sticks the edge of its shell in between there so they can't close completely again. And then he can squirt digestive enzymes in there and liquefy it and slurp it all back up with his tubular mouth. Here, I'll turn that a little. And here's another predatory snail. This one is the crown conch. And although crown conchs are famous for being on oyster reefs and being an important oyster predator, they're also fairly common in seagrass beds. And they're called crown conchs because they have these little points around the circular parts of the shell, like little spires on a crown. And they have this big, fat, muscly foot that they just mow down other organisms, other bivalves or other snails, and then they feed on those. And this we also found while we were there. These are called, these are the eggs of this crown conch. And inside each of these little capsules is 20 to 30 baby crown conchs. And when they are ready to emerge into the outside world, they're going to secrete a little enzyme that opens up one end of this little capsule and allows them to get free and start foraging for themselves out in the seagrass beds. Now, you also find lots of hermit crabs. This is probably the most common hermit crab in Florida. You can find it on beaches almost everywhere, but one of the reasons I know this one may have come from Port St. Joe Bay area is that it's in a tulip snail shell. This one's the banded tulip, a cousin to the true tulip that we just took a look at. Okay, and they make wonderful hermit crab shells because they're nice and roomy and round, and they're very lightweight. So they're like a perfect little hermit crab house. Now, we did find several fish while we were there. Among the fish that you might find would be Skull's mullet, the drum, both red drum and black drum, feeding on things like the clams and the snails and the sea cucumbers, other slower moving fish. Speckled trout, we saw schools of speckled trout, and we pulled a seine and we collected this little guy. Let's see if I can, yeah, I'm trying and not have quite so much. And he obviously, he's very, very fast. But he is related to the flounders. You could see the real white bottom to that fish when he turned over there. Both of his eyes are on one side, and underneath that larger eye is his mouth, which would open normally. They swim kind of by undulating the body back and forth, and so they are related to flounders. They just have this really distinctive tongue shape. Okay, and here's another couple fish that you might find in Port St. Joe. The seahorse, and this one's called a grass porgy. This one has a real blotched coloration that would help it to hide in amongst the blades of grass in the seagrass bed. And the seahorses, just like in this picture, usually anchor themselves around a blade of seagrass. There it is. And then they can just kind of drift back and forth in the water. And there are also large numbers of pike fish, which are related to the seahorses, but they're long and slender, and they have that same little tubular snout that we see on the seahorses, and they just undulate back and forth with the grasses. They're virtually impossible to see when you are snorkeling through the seagrass bed. We also caught baby sea robins. There were some baby puffer fish there. A lot of silver sides, which is a little schooling bait fish. A lot of silver perch, which is a little schooling a small little drum. We found hog choker, which is another member of the flounder group. What else did we catch? I'm trying to think as far as fish were concerned. The large numbers of fish make themselves at home.
Are there sharks?
In these areas. There are sharks there. We didn't see any, but I have heard there are some really big sharks that come into Port St. Joe Bay because there's a deep channel down through the middle. And so I hear there are some large sharks from deeper water offshore that come into the Port St. Joe Bay area. I've never seen any. I stay in the shallower water because there's so much for me to see there, but I would not be surprised if people caught tigers and hammerheads and some of those larger sharks.
How about stingrays?
Out of there. There are stingrays, and although we didn't see any on our field trip there are Atlantic stingrays, particularly in those sandy areas in between the seagrass beds. And there are also southern stingrays, which is the larger of the two stingrays that are found in the Gulf that are common in Port St. Joe Bay. One of the things that we find most commonly in Port St. Joe Bay are scallops. And scallops are a bivalve, a mollusk with two shells that instead of living buried in sand like a clam, they usually live on top of the sand or on top within the seagrass oftentimes, and they have a very unique shell. If you've seen this sign for the Shell service station, it's based on a scallop shell. And at the back end, or top end actually, of the scallop is these little wings. And when the scallop is frightened, he claps the two shells together, and that forces the water out the two wings and will push him along. It's kind of their own little jet propulsion. Now, how, you might ask, does he know that you're coming his direction? Well, the scallops have lots and lots of eyes. Beautiful little blue eyes, built very much like the eyes in vertebrates. Nice and round and blue. They have a pupil, and they're formed from a fold of the scallop's mantle that produces sensory apparatus. I don't know if you can see. Can you see the eyes on that one? Okay, excellent. Okay, so when you swim over and your shadow covers over that little scallop, he's going to know you're there, and he's going to try and get away by clapping those little shells together. Okay, so I might pick this one up and see if sometimes they'll squirt water out trying to get away, just because that's what they would normally do when a big predator threatens them. But probably not. He's just going to close up tight to keep nice water over his entirely on the detritus that that breakdown product of the seagrasses that is in the water. In fact, the day we went, it was pretty poor visibility, and although that's no fun when you're snorkeling and trying to find things, it's really nice for all of those clams and scallops and other things that to turn that into body mass food source. Okay, have we got any questions,
Not today, but thank you, Leslie.
Oh, you're welcome. If you have any questions, go ahead and write them in, and we'll get to them later on today or tomorrow and be happy to answer those questions. So even if you don't get to see it now live, check out that feed later and send us in some questions.
All right, thank you guys.